Well, hello, welcome to my live stream. I am live, I'm here in my studio once again. Okay, so on to the big session that I wanted to talk about today. As I say, the thumbnail says it all. How did I set up my SQ5? And what I was actually going to talk through is how I set it up, in particular for my church Christmas production, because in that setup, what I did was, and while I'm talking, I'm going to just try and find the slides for this one as well. What I did was I went through a fairly big setup for that console. I went through kind of rebuilding the whole desk from scratch, and so I thought it'd be quite a useful way to talk you through my setup process, how I do it, what I go through, all that kind of stuff. Let's jump over to this. Hopefully this is going to be visible. I don't know how visible that is actually. Let me chuck this one up full screen. So this is how I start off building up my SQ5 for the for something like a Christmas production or any kind of production really, and going through all the inputs, all the outputs, where it's going to go, all the routing, all that sort of stuff. For me, it starts with a spreadsheet. And so I build a spreadsheet that looks like this, that I will go through. So you can see at the top, I start off by listing out some of the requirements, so what the band is, what the band lineup's going to look like. I might also include in there like the number of radio mics that we need. Just depending on the context and the situation, you can choose what you want to do. Once I've got the basic overview requirements, I can then start plotting those per channel and start to go through and work out how I'm going to patch all those, what mics, DI boxes, all those kind of things that I'm going to need. And this is just such a helpful way to start planning out your layout of your console before you get too far into the process, because it can get very confusing very quickly, particularly when you start doing groups and DCAs and matrices and all that kind of stuff. You can very quickly start losing track of what audio is being routed where. And if you can build it in a spreadsheet before you do anything on the console, it makes it much easier later on to know where things are routed, how you got the signal from A to B, and where it's patched as well. I try to make sure I include a patch position. So here on this spreadsheet, we've got the mixer channels listed out. So the SQ, I've got up to 48 channels available on the SQ. And I start then to list what I'm going to plug into them: kick, snare, toms, hats, overheads, bass, fuzz bass I did for that one, keys 1, keys 2, I did a fuzz keys as well, acoustic guitar, vocal channels, cues, click, tracks, pads, video playback, kids track. For the Christmas production we did a song with some kids and the kids were dancing to something, so it was a kids playback track, and then some background music, some ambient room mics, radio mics, talkback mics, and then comms. I wouldn't worry too much about the comms. Comms was just a little comm system that we put that actually was going through the sound desk, but don't worry too much about that. So once I've listed out all the channels that I want, from there we can then list out how are we going to get those things in. And so I had in there different microphones that I was using. So on the drum kit, D6, SM57 on the snare, D2, D4, overhead mics, DI boxes, and you can be specific or as generic as you want to on this. So you can see with the DI boxes, I just put DI, I didn't bother with brands and makes and models and stuff. If you need to be specific with your microphones, if you've only got a limited number of microphones and you might want an SM57 on an electric guitar cab, but I've only got one of them and I also want it on the snare drum, you might need to start listing out specific makes and models of things that you're going to use in certain places. That just depends on your context again, sort of where those things are coming from and how many of them you've got available. So be as detailed in there as you need to be. I then, for our context, we have a bunch of small analog stage boxes that will run from our stage to our main digital stage box. So we've just got some short analog stage boxes that give us patch positions around on stage. So we've got box A, box B, box C, just goes around the stage, A, B, C, D, E, F. So we can choose where we're going to position things. So we know that, for example, box A is in the drum booth, and anything patching in the drum booth is going to be patched into A 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 there. And basically the way it works out is that every position on stage has its own stage box. So drums has A, whatever, acoustic guitar might be in B, vocals in C and D, bass is in F. Here I've got bass patched to F2, you can see. And hopefully every musician can just stand by a stage box and patch directly into that stage box. For more complicated services, so something like the Christmas service, it might be that things get a little bit messed around. So you can see there, acoustic guitar was patched into A9. So the acoustic guitar was actually patched into the drum booth just because we ran out of sockets in other places. So it was just the easiest way to do that. Another thing to note here as well is that some of these channels I was doubling up on. So where I've got bass and fuzz bass, what I was actually doing, there was just a single feed. So one bass, one DI box fed into one socket, but then I was double patching that on the desk. So I was patching that to 2 separate channels and then just processing those channels separately on the desk. And there's a couple of reasons for doing that. One in this case was because I was just adding a bit of fuzz to that. So the way I did that was on the console. Let me cut to this one. On the SQ console over here, one of the things that you can do is to change there's a preamp emulator, tube preamp emulator that you can add onto the preamps. And so that's what I did. I put on the preamp, I put on a tube emulator that was just adding just a little bit of fuzz distortion to that and just overdriving that tube preamp a little bit just to give a little bit of fuzz to it. And that's how I was creating that bass sound. And in the context of bass, I wasn't panning those, but with the things like acoustic guitar, I'll pull that one back up again. Acoustic guitar there, channels 16 and 17, patched into A9 and into the stage box, digital stage box socket number 13. That was patched in twice. And what I was doing there was creating a stereo image. So I was, again, just taking one acoustic guitar with one mono feed into one DI box, patching it twice, panning them left and right, and then just processing them slightly different. So one had a little bit more compression on it, one had a slightly different EQ to the other, but I was just creating a stereo image out of what would have otherwise been a mono feed. So there's kind of 2 ways that you can use that, either to create 2 different sounds and then blend between them, so clean bass, fuzz bass. The clean bass was just significantly higher than the fuzz bass much lower, and I can just blend those and use that as I needed to. So the fuzz in that case was just giving a bit of warmth and a bit of depth to that sound. Or in the context of acoustic guitar, left and right, panning them left and right, creating a stereo image, another little technique that I like to use for something like that, and just create a bit more stereo width and space in that mix. And as you can see, all of that is planned out on the spreadsheet in advance. So I know exactly where things are plugged in, what I'm using to plug them in, where I'm going to patch them on stage. And if it's not a source on stage, you can see here there's things like the laptop, click cues and tracks. For example, here coming from a laptop being fed from USB, I had a USB feed for that. And Pro Presenter here, we in our situation, we have some pads tracks that we play through from Pro Presenter. Video playback, kids tracks, all of this came from Pro Presenter, and all of that was fed via Dante. So I had a Dante feed bringing all of that audio in. So it might not necessarily be a local stage patch, it might be fed from something else somewhere else instead. And then things like radio mics weren't on stage, they were just connected via the local sockets on the back of the console, and brought into the console from the sockets on the back of the mixing desk itself. So a whole different way of connecting in various different sources, all listed out here on the spreadsheet. So from there, I can then choose where I'm going to feed that audio source. And you can see here, I either feed it through a group or a DCA. One of the sessions that was on, the wheel of knowledge, was the differences between groups, DCAs, and matrices. And I'd probably quite like to do that session at some point. I'll talk you through the differences of what these all are. But for the time being, just know that they are different things, groups and DCAs. So the drum mics were all being fed actually into two different groups, and then further over here, this section, I identified what the groups were and what they're all doing. So I had an overall drum group, but I also had a drum effects group, so I could add some reverb just generally to the whole drum sound. So I had an effect that was just applied to group 3. So I could have a bit of drum verb, which I could then just push that up if I needed to add more drum verb in, or drop it out if I wanted to lose the drum verb a bit. So drums were being fed to groups 1 and 3. Vocal group here, my vocal mics were being fed into group 2. That was my vocal group. And then on top of that, then I was also using DCAs to control levels as well. So I had a DCA 1, which was my drum DCA, DCA 1 and 2. Sorry, actually DCA 1 is my, where are the DCAs? DCA's here. DCA 1 was my instruments. So I actually feed all of my instruments into a single DCA, and that gives me the ability to be able to balance things like the band to the vocals. So if I get a good band mix, but just the whole band is just drowning the vocals out a little bit, I can just pull the whole band down by a couple of dB and push all the vocals up by a little bit as well, and I can just balance between the whole band and all the vocals as well, and I quite often do that in a DCA. So DCA 1 was all of my instruments, so everything, drums, bass, keys, guitar, all of those were going through DCA 1. And then on top of that, so the bass here going through DCA 1 and DCA 2, because I had two bass channels, clean bass, fuzz bass, both of those two going into a DCA, I could then have one fader, one DCA fader, to adjust the overall bass level. So once I'd got my balance between clean bass and fuzz bass, I could then just use my DCA to take the whole bass level up and down. Similar kind of thing with guitars and keys. We had two different keyboard players. So keys 1 and keys 2, and then keys 2, I also had to add a fuzz layer on the keys 2. So again, I could balance that, just again adding a bit more depth and body to that sound. And then all of that fed into a DCA. So all of these things, I can just balance these all independently. So all of this is identified on this spreadsheet. It also means that I can also work out with things like the SQ, you've got a limited number of buses available. So those could be aux feeds for band monitors. So you can see here I had all my band monitors, all my outputs labeled. So I was using 7 aux feeds for band for this particular event. I was then also sending an aux feed, so that comm system I was using was on an aux feed, although actually we ended up not using that anyway. I had an online aux feed, and then I had, so that was the comms, and then the Matrix 1 for my main PA. But I was basically using 7 in-ear monitors plus 1 for online, so I had 8 aux feeds being used. And that means I only then have available 4 additional bus that I can use for groups. And all of these things just help you to know how to set that console up, because that's a fairly major console change. If I suddenly discovered that I needed 10 in-ear monitor mixes on stage, it would mean that I'd have to lose some of my groups, and the whole way that the console is set up changes because I didn't quite have enough in-ear monitor mixes. And so it's those kind of things that are really helpful to identify on a spreadsheet before you even get to programming up the console at all. So all of that listed in here. How many in-ears am I using? What other auxes am I using? All that kind of stuff. Where are my effects is going to be used, and how am I going to use all of those? You've got 8 effects bus available. Sorry, 8 effects rack units available in the SQ5, but you've actually only got 4 effects bus. So we can only use 4 of them on a bus return system. And then the others I can then just use as inserts directly into either a channel or a group. So as I say, things like drum verb, I could just insert onto a group. and use that to control verb to my drums. Similarly, guitar chorus here was just inserted directly onto a channel rather than being fed through a bus. So you can get creative with how you use those effects if you needed to. And the more detail that you can put into this spreadsheet, the easier it becomes later on. Once you've got this kind of really worked out, really nailed down, how you're going to build all this up, you can then start to apply all of these settings into your console. And that's one of the things that just really makes this so much easier to do. And all of that, as I say, detailed out in advance, so I know exactly what's going where I need to program it all. And once I've got that all set and locked in, I then will start to add all of those settings into the actual desk itself. Now, what I think I'm going to do, just to save on time, because this is going to end up running on really long, I am going to break this session down into another session. So I'm going to come back and do a part 2 of this, where I'll actually show you how we start to build all of those things into the desk itself. And I'll show you the software, and I'll show you the actual console and how we program all those things up, how we add things into groups, how we add things into DCAs, all of that sort of stuff into another session.